All right, well, great. It's good to see everybody here tonight, and I'm really looking forward to talking about seeds and native plants and climate change and what we can do about it to some degree. And it's really a pleasure for me to be here while everyone is reading The Seed Keepers, and I've been reading it too. It's an excellent book. I've been really drawn into it. One aspect of the book is that between Native Americans and the plants that they use for food and medicine, etc., she points out that there's an agreement. There is a bond in which the seeds and the people have agreed to take care of one another. And really that theme runs through what we're talking about today. Although we're not necessarily talking about food plants, we are talking about the plants that take care of our earth and us. So first I'm going to give you a little information about the organization I work for, which is the Institute for Applied Ecology. This is a nonprofit organization based in Corvallis, Oregon and Santa Fe, New Mexico. Our mission is to conserve native species and habitats through restoration, research, and education. So we're a nature conservation organization, and we have a broad enough mission that we do research, we do on-the-ground restoration, we get very muddy boots, and we do education. We work with people, we involve the public and many groups of people in the work we do. Our vision is a world where all people in wildlands are healthy and interact positively, biological diversity flourishes, and environmental challenges are met with a social commitment to solving problems with science. We do believe in science. We work really in various places. Sometimes people ask me, so what's the footprint of your organization? And the answer is, well, it kind of depends on the foot. We got a lot of different feet out there. So in the Pacific Northwest, we work in the Willamette Valley, on coastal systems as well, and also on the arid east side of Cascades. In the Southwest, we work primarily in New Mexico, but also in Arizona. But we also have some national projects, such as Project Botany, which is developing curricula, ecoregional curricula throughout the country. We run the Native Seed Network, which is largely an online source for finding native seeds. And we host the National Native Seed Conference. In fact, that was just 2 weeks ago in Washington, D.C. We had about 500 people from all over the country, 47 states and 8 countries total come to this conference, just to talk about native seeds and restoration. Let's see. Our staff in Oregon looks like this. This is our first post-pandemic photograph of our staff, and so you can see people without their masks on, but also there's a lot of new faces in our organization. During the pandemic, as with many organizations, we had a lot of turnover, and so it was sad to see some people go, but it's been also great to see some new and exciting personalities and skills join our organization. We are a nonprofit, therefore we're run by a board of directors. This is some of the folks on our board of directors, and we're often recruiting, so if you're interested in joining a group like ours on the board, we'd love to have your time, talent, and treasure to help us out. We also include interns and younger technicians in the work we do. We've had well over 100 young people come through our organization doing seasonal work to help them understand our field and attract them to the field so that they can pursue careers in this area. And in the time I've been working on this, which is over 20 years, we've had people come through as young adults interested in the field, and many of them now have PhDs or are higher up in the government and have worked through their careers. So we're very proud to have helped people through their career decisions and joining this field. We work a lot with endangered species. We're very interested in recovering endangered species. This is what you call moving species, say, from the endangered species list off of the list. It's called recovery. And so we work with all of the species here and several others, just in Oregon and in New Mexico, many others. And one of the things we do is we actually establish new populations of these species in protected habitats often using seeds. And by doing so, we're able to actually get them on a path off of the endangered species list. So for example, this species right here is Bradshaw's lomatium. It used to be a threatened species and has now been what they call delisted. It's no longer on the endangered species list. This species here is Nelson's checker mallow. Almost the same story. It's proposed for delisting right now. And this is Fender's blue butterfly on a rare plant called Kincaid's lupin. The butterfly is endangered, and it's about to move from endangered status to threatened status because of the conservation of habitats that we get involved with. Willamette Valley is really a hot spot for endangered species recovery because of this large-scale work we do. We don't work at small scales for many of these. We're out there planting millions of seeds over tens to hundreds of acres. So we're really trying to get these species vastly more abundant than they used to be. We also engage in butterfly conservation. As you might know, butterflies are botanists. They spend their every waking hour, if you can call it that, focused on plants. All of these butterflies, the Taylor's checker spot is endangered, the Fender's blue is endangered, almost threatened, the Oregon silver spot is endangered, the monarch is really heading towards endangerment. They're all specialists on particular kinds of plants. Every single one of these butterflies requires a particular kind of plant to lay its eggs on and for its larvae to feed. Without that plant, no butterfly. It's very straightforward. The Taylor's checker spot, though, has really performed a hat trick here, where its main host plant was a paintbrush, an Indian paintbrush. However, that species become much more rare on our landscape. And a related plant, the English plantain, you might not think of it as related, but it is related, it's an invasive species, so it's more abundant. It has stepped in and become the new host plant for this butterfly. So a very interesting biology. The Kincaid's lupin is a rare lupin, and that's why the butterfly, Fender's blue, is also rare, because its host is rare. The Oregon silver spot only grows on early blue violet, which occurs on the coast in pastures and headlands that are now invaded by pasture grasses. And those grasses outcompete the violet, and that's why this butterfly has declined. And monarchs, as you all know, I'm sure, love milkweed. And as milkweeds have declined, monarchs have followed suit. So when we're talking about butterfly conservation, that's all well and good. But to do that, we have to do plant conservation. We have to do plant conservation. It's not a choice. That's how you do butterfly conservation. And we also get into bird conservation because many of these birds require certain structure or certain kinds of prairies or grasslands. So for example, the western meadowlark, Oregon's state bird, has declined substantially in the Willamette Valley to the point where it's actually relatively uncommon now because it needs large open areas in order to have a habitat for a mating pair. Like 20 acres at least, more like 60, 80, 100 acres to have a thriving habitat for, nesting habitat for western meadowlarks. The streaked hornlark requires open grassland and even bare soil, either on the coast or in the valley. The Vesper sparrow requires, it's a migratory bird, but it requires open, large expanses of open grassland. And the slender-billed white-breasted nuthatch requires oaks in order to complete its life cycle. One thing we've done is documented that when we restore habitat from, say, pasture land to a more diverse prairie, we create better habitat for western meadowlarks, and more pairs will nest in the same size area if it's a restored habitat. So it's not just being open or just being grass, it's actually the nature of, the quality of that habitat that they're flying over. We also do pollinator conservation. We've got now going into our 5th year of a Willamette Valley pollinator project, trying to understand what are the bees, what are the flies that are coming to flowers, and what are the relationships between them. And some of the findings are really blowing our minds because we've been returning to the same places year after year, and what we're finding is the collection of pollinators is different. every year. The pollinators, the insects, have these wild population swings from year to year. So it's very important to have a diversity of them, because when it's a good year for one, it's a bad year for another. And they take over for each other from year to year as you have different, wet years and dry years, cold years and warm years, etc. And we, like I said, we get our boots dirty doing habitat restoration, and we use all kinds of techniques to convert weedy grasslands, for example, into diverse prairies with lots of wild flowers and plants that habitat and animals need. So we use burning, we use mowing, we do use herbicide in some cases to kill grass or other plants and restore what we want instead. And we work in upland prairies and grassland prairies, and we work in partnership with people as much as we can. And finally, about our organization, members are partners in this work. We do need to connect with folks and have people support the work we do financially and through their time. So I invite you all to become members of the Institute for Applied Ecology or make a donation. So now we'll segue and talk more about seeds and climate change and what's going on in the real world here today. I have three main messages for you. The first is that climate change is affecting native plants today and forward. It's already affecting native plants. This isn't something that's happening tomorrow. It's something that's actually happened yesterday, and we're just starting to wake up to the fact that this is a process that's been going for decades now. Also, nature is important to human health. We actually depend on nature in ways that we don't always acknowledge or even think about. And I'll touch on that more. And then climate-centered restoration is crucial. When we're doing habitat restoration, we need to be thinking about how we're going to create climate-resilient habitats. What are the species? What is the genetics of those species that make them resilient in a changing and more dynamic habitat and environment? Okay, well, welcome to the Anthropocene. When I was young and in college, I learned that the geologic period we're currently in was called the Holocene. But that was before we recognized that our activities through the Industrial Revolution and all the way through today have pumped so many greenhouse gases into the atmosphere that we've actually changed conditions on the surface of the planet itself. By creating greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, we're warming the Earth. We're allowing more of the sun's energy to enter our atmosphere and occupy the Earth and create more dynamic storms, stronger droughts, stronger winters even. We're noticing it, right? It's on the news every year. Locally we have heat domes right now. I mean, 2 years ago we had a heat dome. It was like 115 degrees at my house. We don't do 115 degrees in Oregon, right? That's like off the table. But now we do. Okay, so that's extreme, and it is harmful. So many of these kinds of graphs, I'm sure, look familiar to you. This shows that over time, temperatures have warmed slightly, and that by the end of the century, they're likely to warm very significantly. If we look for where we are on this graph, we're sort of right in here. Okay, so it's gone up some. We're about a quarter of the way through the century, and we're about a quarter of the way through the heating we expect to see. Okay, quarter of the way so far, and we've got another 3/4 of change by the end of the century. Now, I don't expect to live that long, but I sure hope my children and their children do. And that means, climate change-wise, we ain't seen nothing yet. It's going to get a lot different. So we have to pay attention to this. We have to plan for it. Very interesting point to think about is that it looks as though the precipitation, the annual precipitation is potentially going to stay about the same. Or another way to look at this is the models have a lot of variability, meaning, well, it might get wetter or drier, we don't know. This is in a sense an error bar here. We don't really know what's going to happen. But even if it stays the same amount of moisture, it will get drier. But what I mean there is that even if we have the same amount of precipitation, with this heating, the soils will dry out more than they have in the past. So wetter actually can be drier, and that's a problem for plants because they're adapted to the hydrology, to the amount of moisture in the soil at different parts of the year. And if that moisture leaves the soil quickly through evapotranspiration, then that moisture is no longer available to plants. So that's one of the signals that plants are really reading in their environment, more so sometimes than temperature, is moisture availability in the ground. So some effects of climate change that are already very apparent on plants, and we're going to go through some of these and some of the science that's going on, is there's a loss of biological diversity. Plant diversity is declining because of climate change. There's changes in phenology. Phenology means the timing of certain life history events. And in particular, when people talk about plant phenology, they're talking about when do plants bloom. We're seeing changes in when plants bloom. We're seeing range shifts. The distribution on the landscape is changing of some plants. They're dying out in some areas or moving into new areas, or dying out and not moving. We're seeing species extinctions. That dying out in a part of a range might be all of the range, and species are declining. We're losing diversity, and part of that is because of extinctions or even just local extinctions. And some of these climate change effects have complex interactions with land use. The effect of climate change may depend on how we manage the lands that we own as public agencies or as private landowners. How we manage those lands affects how climate change will affect the vegetation there. So here's an example of diversity loss. This is an observed diversity loss. The folks that did this study, Damshin et al., they revisited some plots that were put out by a guy named Whitaker in the 1950s. And he did this down in the Siskiyous in southwestern Oregon. He put out all these plots, and he was just describing the vegetation. He was a very important ecologist that came up with some new ideas about how to understand plant communities on the landscape. But what he didn't realize he was doing was measuring a baseline by which we could compare our time now to the past. And so these guys went out and they revisited his plots in 2010. And what they found was between 1950 and 2007 in particular, there was about a decline of 75% of the number of species they found in these plots of plants. That's a big decline. And there was some nuance to this. The declines were stronger in species that were more northern species, but they just had a little bit of their range in the southern area, in this area. So as it got warmer, that was just too warm for them, and they were left going north. So those species declined. We also are seeing, or what they found was that there was a shift of some of the southern slope plants over to the north. And so while some of the plants on the north died out entirely, they were replaced by species that sort of moved around the slope to sort of escape the heating climate. So that's actually, in real measurable time in our lifespans, we're seeing this happen on a large scale. Here's phenology. Remember, this is bloom time in particular. This is a study where these folks looked at herbarium specimens. Now, these are specimens of plants that were collected in the wild, pressed flat, glued to paper, and given a label with a date on it and some other information. But what that allows you to do is go back through lots and lots of records and figure out when were plants collected or when were they in bloom, and see if that's changed over time. And so they went back, about 100 years. And what they're finding is that for every 1 degree of temperature increase, we're seeing about a 4.5 day shift to earlier bloom time. So that's maybe not huge, but what's interesting about it is it's not uniform. So this is happening, the early bloomers are shifting earlier, faster. Plants at low elevations are blooming earlier, and plants in maritime areas are blooming earlier, much earlier. And if you look at late bloomers, they're shifting less, those things that come on later in the summer. Things at higher elevations or in arid areas, their timing isn't changing as much. So it's really interesting. It's not just one way plants are responding everywhere. We need to be paying attention to the fact that it's different in different places, and that might affect our strategies. Ranges, the distributions on the landscape of plants may need to shift with climate change, and if they don't, we're looking at extinctions of species. So this is a study that used a manipulative experiment where they put out warming structures and rain control structures to manipulate climate in an existing area to mimic what will happen with climate change. So they actually heated up a box around a plot of ground. And these were all in prairies. And what they found, just some of the results, were that these species, like Romer's fescue and a dandelion, a native one, and a grass called California oatgrass, that these species were declining when they heated the environment and caused drought, like climate change is causing. So these are native species that started to decline when they were given these treatments. These species here actually point out a very different situation. It's when these species were moved further north, these ones occurred down here, and they were moved up here or here. And when they were moved north and then given these climate treatments, they started doing very well. In other words, they're southern species that are going to adapt well to a changing climate. So that suggests that these species may die out and these species may move. This is an interesting study and somewhat alarming. This has to do with trees, and that these trees are having trouble reproducing in some parts of their range. So this figure over here on the right, just notice these dots that are to the left of this bold line. Those to the left are showing that the populations of those trees are weak in seedlings while strong in adults. The seedlings are not coming up. The trees are not reproducing. And this is happening in environments where it's getting warmer and drier. So there are many tree species, and look at the amount of data that went into this. This is something like 14,000 plots. So these are very robust results. We're seeing certain species of trees that are unable to reproduce in the hotter, drier parts of their range as the climate is changing. So the trees may still be standing there, and they may look okay. They're just not making babies. So they will eventually die. There'll be a fire or pathogens or something that will stress them and kill them, and they will be gone. Those species won't be there anymore. They can't grow there. They can't reproduce. So some trees are losing out in the southern or hotter part of their range, and they're going to have to move north or uphill. This is some results from some experiments, or not experiments, but observations we've made and published. And this has to do with an orchid called the clustered ladies slipper orchid. And this is a species that occurs largely in old-growth forests. And we conducted this work in Northern California and Southern Oregon. And what we found was when we found documentation of existing populations and then went back to those to see if they were still there. In many cases, they weren't there anymore. In fact, about half of them were gone. So there's a big database that shows where all these rare species are, and we're finding that the database is overly optimistic, because when we go back, these species, the individuals' populations have already died out. And we wanted to know, well, what's associated with that die out that we're seeing? And this is the kind of habitat the species it grows in. And here's what's going on. There's two parts of this are very intuitive. The extinction probability of a population declined as the population size was bigger. So bigger populations were less likely to go extinct in a period of, say, 0 to 30 years that we were looking. And as time goes by, extinction is more likely. So regardless of the size, if it's been a long time, it's more likely a population would go extinct. Okay, that's all very intuitive, makes sense. But the climate change signature is over here on the right, and that is that as elevation goes up, extinction goes down, or extinction's higher at lower elevations. And when we're seeing warming happen, the lower elevations are the part of the population or part of the plant's distribution that gets trimmed off first. Now they're going to have to move uphill. We're not seeing evidence of them moving uphill. We're just seeing evidence of them losing the lower elevation part of their range. Now, remember I mentioned that sometimes it may be that the effects of climate change will depend on how we manage land. And here's an example of that. So this is from a study we conducted. It was a 10-year study on public land looking at another rare plant called Green's Mariposa lily. And so we were just looking at wild population dynamics. We looked at it long enough and with enough detail that we could put together computer models to forecast the population's trends into the future. So we wanted to say, okay, given what's going on in the past, what's likely to happen to this population? It's a technique called population viability analysis. But what we did in this case was compared what's going on with the past dynamics with what would happen if the climate were to change. We had enough information on the population's biology, the population's dynamics and how it's associated with weather events to say, well, if the weather is going to change as climate changes, how is that going to drive the population? We also did this in plots that were open to cattle use and in plots that we'd fenced to keep cattle out. So we had two scenarios, a fenced to keep cows out and a not fenced and cattle just business as usual out in rangeland. And what we found was that when cows were present, we had population declines, both in the climate change scenario in red and in the non-climate change scenario in blue. Of course, we know that the non-climate change scenario just isn't even real because that's not happening. But if we removed cattle, it reversed conditions completely. In fact, climate change might even benefit the species slightly if they're not stressed by grazing from livestock and other herbivores. So how the land is managed is really going to affect how our land responds to climate change. And in this case, it's really a matter of stressors. Grazing by cattle stresses the vegetation. If we change the climate also, it just makes that climate change effect worse. Now, that's how plants are changing already. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about what plants are doing for us in our human health. So, first off, many of us really value nature. Right? We see the natural world and that gives us solace. We use nature to help us get through tough times or even normal days. We just like looking out the window and seeing the birds come to the bird feeder, whatever it is. And when we see habitats and places that we love go, whether that's to a housing development or climate change or a fire or whatever, that causes us grief. It's real, it's tangible. We can feel that. At least I can. I notice it. I feel it in my gut. The name for that feeling is solastalgia. And it's the feeling you get of loss and grief when your environment that you love disappears. Okay, so we know that we love nature to some degree, and we know that when we lose it, it's a visceral feeling for us. We also know that when nature's there and we can take a walk in the park, for example, it helps calm us. It can lower our blood pressure, it can help us deal with depression or a tough day or whatever conversation's been in our head that we need to get out. You just take a walk in the park, go for a walk in the forest, just go sit outside. You don't need to be convinced. There's published literature that really demonstrates all of this, but we all know it, right? You didn't need to do any research to find that out. Okay, so it's important to us. It extends beyond just being able to take a walk in the park. For people who are incarcerated and are in prison, exposure to even nature imagery can reduce stress and incidents of violence. So this is at the core of being human. When we're deprived of access to nature, it affects our behavior. And when we're restored, even through just looking at pictures, it can change our behavior back to a better baseline. This is real. This is documented. One of the projects we work on is called the Sagebrush in Prisons Project, where we work with prison inmates who run native plant nurseries, and those nurseries produce sagebrush that are then planted into public lands to restore habitat after wildfire to benefit the greater sage grouse, which is a bird in decline. And when we started getting into this, we were really thinking, this is a great way to produce sagebrush, isn't that great? But what I didn't realize was how it would affect me as a person to work person to person with adults in custody who had been deprived of nature and deprived of a method of giving back to their own communities, that it changed their lives completely, and that changed my life. So there's this ripple effect of doing good to nature does good to humans, and it just bounces back and forth and amplifies. Now, it's not just like thinking about nature or looking at nature that's good for us. It is. But there are things about nature that get on us and get in us that are also good. So what I'm pointing out here is that in wildlands, in the soil, on the leaves of plants, there are microorganisms. Those microorganisms interact with us. I mean, we all know this, right? You think, I'm me, I'm one organism, but actually I'm trillions of organisms. I'm actually, I'm way outnumbered by bacteria and fungi and protists and all kinds of things on me, right? Well, those things that are on me are interacting in a whole community, and when that's out of balance, I get sick. And when it's in balance, I'm more well. So this study here, which was done in Australia, this is fascinating. What they looked at was when they restored, say, a disturbed ecosystem that had been taken down to pasture, when they restored it back to some shrubland and then into forest, what they found was the soil microbiome became more diverse and more healthy towards humans. So in this figure over here, what they're showing is that there are over here these opportunistic bacteria and things that are often pathogenic to humans. And as this habitat gets restored, that group declines, and we see these other organisms that are beneficial to human increase in their quantity. And so we can restore habitats so that they're better for us physically. And that's an important take-home that is often overlooked that we need to think about. This is part of what is called the old friends hypothesis, that of course we evolved out in nature, and many of these bacteria and other organisms evolved with us, and we're geared to being occupied by some of them and not by others. Those are our old friends, the good ones. This is what this is called. And this is showing the same pattern again. As you go from a lawn to a tree planting to do some restoration, more restoration, et cetera, you go from a wide proportion of these pathogenic types to a bigger proportion of our old friends. And those get on us and in us and around us. Even living next to a park in a city is good for you. Open the window, let nature in. Even that park is offering you something good for your body. So these folks here have put together what they call the microbiome-inspired green infrastructure toolkit. And the whole goal here is to try to take urban spaces that are parks and make them more biologically diverse. That diversity of plants is actually the key. The plant diversity is what improves the microbiome diversity and the bird diversity and the pollinator diversity, et cetera. And then when we open the window and it gets on us, it's better for us. More on the same topic, but what's being pointed out here is that climate change has negative effects on ecosystems, it has negative effects on people, et cetera. But when we start restoring habitats over here, we start getting beneficial effects of ecosystems counteracting climate change, beneficial effects of ecosystems on people, and people, by doing these things, improving ecosystems themselves. So we can push back on the negative feedbacks and start making them positive. All right, so remember seeds? We're going to talk a little about seeds. So some of how we restore habitats, so they're good for us in a context of climate change, has to do with where we get the seeds to do it. Sourcing plants for habitat restoration in a changing climate means we have to rethink some of how we've done restoration and seed plant selection in the past. So for example, we know through research and practice that plants are locally adapted. They do best where they came from because through natural selection, they're tuned to do best in a particular rainfall environment or on a particular soil or a particular heat dynamic, etc. But local isn't local anymore because climate is changing. So we need to think about future climate analogs. This is a term for it. Where is our tomorrow climate today? So first off, local adaptation. In case you don't believe it's real, this was a study we were involved in that looked at over 300 experiments that were called common gardens. And a common garden is a really cool experiment. It's where you take plants from a whole bunch of different places and you plant them together in one common environment. It's called a common garden. And when you do that, any differences between them are genetic because you've removed the environmental differences of where they came from. They're all growing in the same place. So you could look for genetic differences in their phenotype just by growing them together. Okay, makes sense? And what we found in this is by reviewing over 300 studies that did this, is that there is variation among populations. This is the grist of evolution, right? Populations vary from place to place. This doesn't mean local adaptation, but it's the first signal. You have to have this before you can find local adaptation. A subset of these we could look at and ask, well, does that variation vary with the environment? Trait by environment variation? And the answer is yes, 86% of the time, the variation is driven by the environment. Okay, that's local adaptation. And 75% of the time, it was driven by climate. So yeah, there's lots of ways places differ from one another, but the big signal here is climate. And then there's the question, does the local type do better than the non-local type? Is there a home site advantage? And the answer is, although we had fewer studies we could ask this question, the answer was resounding yes. 67% greater survival, 90% better flowering if the plants came from the local area. So this is really comprehensive and convincing, compelling evidence that local adaptation is real. So in the absence of climate change, we should be definitely trying to plant local stuff and not be saying like, oh, I'll get my grass seed from Idaho and plant it in the Willamette Valley. Well, just waste your seed. It's going to die out. Why would you do that? But now we have to think about it. So over here on the right here, this is results from a study where some folks looked at where a particular rare species occurred and then mapped out where its climate appears to be moving because it's getting warmer and drier, so its climate is actually, of where it grows now, is leaving. So if that plant is going to track that, where is it going to have to go? And on the right here, this is all Midwest and Eastern species, and they're mostly going north, but you get out to the west, and things change, and they're going every which way. Any ideas why that would be? Why would it be one way over here and another thing over there? Mountains. We have mountains. We have topography out west, right? So the direction to go to follow your climate isn't always north. It might be uphill. It might be south to go uphill, right? So it gets really complicated in the west. Okay, so there are a number of strategies for picking where you're going to get your seeds for restoration. They're strictly local. I'm only going to get it from the same stand of trees. It's got to be right here where I'm working. It could be relaxed. Well, I'm willing to go to a couple of parcels nearby, but it's still got to be really local. There's composite mix. Okay, I'm going to go to a whole bunch of populations in my area and use those populations, but it's still got to be local. There's admixture. I don't care where it came from. I'm going to put every population from the range of the species in one melting pot and let nature sort it out. And then there's predictive matching, which is, don't go crazy with it. Think about where your tomorrow climate is today and start looking for seeds from those to bring those in. So the top ones here are composite mix and predictive matching. Top because this is what we do or we're considering doing in our organization in order to source seeds. So here's an example of composite mix and why this is good. Here's the Willamette Valley. This is the Willamette Valley ecoregion. And every one of these dots is a place where we've collected seeds of Oregon iris, Iris tenax, right here. And then we take them and we grow them together in a nursery and where they can interbreed, and then we get all these seeds off of them, and then we have enough seeds we can actually do restoration with it. Okay, so we're getting both local adaptation because it's all Willamette Valley, and we're getting genetic diversity because we're collecting from a lot of different places in the Willamette Valley. So we're making this kind of hyper-diverse gene pool to work with. And we put that out on the landscape, and we've got local diversity, but we got genetic diversity. We want local and diverse. We're getting both. That's the sweet spot here. That's what we want. Okay, that's in the absence of climate change. So, okay, but what do you do with climate change? How do you predict where your tomorrow climate is today? Well, fortunately, we do have some really useful tools, and some of them are available online. Anybody can use them. This one here is called the Seed Lot Selection Tool. It was put together by the Conservation Biology Institute, another nonprofit in Corvallis that we like to work with, and the U.S. Forest Service. It allows you to identify locations from which seeds may be moved to a new site to match your future climate. And you can look out mid-century or end of century and say, okay, where do I have to go to find the seeds for tomorrow? And its great strength is that it allows the user to specify the climate scenario. And its great weakness is it allows the user to specify the climate scenario. So it can be, if you're not really sure which dial to move, it can be hard to know how to use it. I think they're going to start building in some better defaults, I've been told. But it's very powerful. And here's an example. This is a project we're working on with a group called Clean Water Services. Some of you may drink water from your taps from Clean Water Services. They get their water out of the Willamette River and other sources. And to do that, they need to have a permit to do that, they need to provide shade over the river so they don't warm the river. Right? So to get the permit to take the water out, they can't warm the river because the river is habitat for salmon. So they need trees. They plant lots of trees along the Willamette to cool the river. And they're thinking forward. Well, the trees we're planting, are they going to last? Are they going to grow well here in 20 years, 10 years? Are they already dying out? What are we going to do? So they're being very proactive, and they're starting to think, okay, what can we do? So we're working with them, and we started using the seed lot selection tool. And what we're seeing is that the area up here in this Tualatin Basin is, by mid-century, its climate will be represented here and here, and then even better down here. Red means a better fit. It doesn't necessarily mean hotter. It just means a better match to what the climate will be like here. And if you go towards the end of the century, nothing in Oregon is a climate analog for the future there. It's all down here in California, in Redding area and out towards the coast. So, wow, okay. So now what we're doing is we're putting together our own common garden experiment with them. And what we're going to do is grow 20 or so different woody species, trees and shrubs, together from populations throughout these areas and see which ones grow best here now already. And this is an experiment that will go on for several years, so we'll be learning more as time goes by. And we can actually start to think not just where we're going to get them, but really which ones should we plant and in which proportions. Here's an example of a species that this is going to be important for. This is white alder. Now, the alder that most of us know locally is red alder. Red alders are doing poorly in the Willamette Valley. It's hard to find a healthy population of red alders. But white alder, which is a more southern species and just sort of pokes up the Willamette Valley a little ways in Oregon, is doing great. And it looks like this is a species that could expand. So if you want to have healthy trees, red alder may not be the way to go anymore, but white alder might. Also, it might not just be red alder is no good, but the genotype of red alder, the genetic type we have, may not be very vigorous here anymore because of climate change. If we had a genotype or a genetic type of red alder from further south, that might do well here as red alder. So we'll grow both species in this common garden study and learn about this. But in the meantime, we're also thinking, you know, a 20-year study is kind of a long time. We might need to take action sooner than later. What we're thinking about now as our organization is, remember these slides, we've got local adaptation and you've got genetic diversity. This is the sweet spot. When we look in the future, we know that climate matching may be what we need to consider. So the new sweet spot might be, well, we want local and we want diverse and we want climate matched. We want this center spot. We kind of want everything. In other words, we want adapted and adaptable. And the way we achieve that is not by picking one type, but by mixing them together. Take our local types, that's great, but also start stirring into the gene pool some of the southern genetic material so that we're giving our local populations a chance to respond to natural selection. So they don't die out, they just get selected from. That's what we want. Then we can have a resilient group of individuals that over time can replace each other as the climate changes. That's the goal. And my feeling is that we need to start doing that now, ahead of the research. In fact, there's been already a lot of research that shows that southern types are doing better than northern types already in our area. So while for many of us in my profession have been slow to take this on because we're steeped in the local advantage, local adaptation paradigm, I think it's time for us to wake up and realize that things have changed. Local isn't local anymore. Therefore, let's act on it. But let's not be rash. We could make mistakes, that's true. But let's just be judicious. Let's not only plant things from California in Oregon, for example, but let's allow some of that to mix in. So we're giving our ecosystems a chance. So I'm going to close there. I don't know where we are on time. I think we're doing pretty good. But also, just to end, you know, we need the younger generation. We need the older generation. We all need to pool together and support this kind of work and think this through and come to a decision as a society, as a community, and how we're going to address these issues. They're here now. They're not just coming in the future. They're here today. And so we need to act. I'm going to close there.
Do you want to take questions?
Yes. And we can take questions. Right here and then there.
When you're talking about doing this large-scale restoration of plants that are already endangered, which makes me think there's a lot less of them, how do you collect enough seed to do what you need to do?
So the question was, how do you collect enough seeds of rare or endangered species in order to put out a lot of them on the ground? Well, fortunately, in the Willamette Valley, as an example, many of these rare species do have a few bigger populations left. And so we can collect seeds from those. We don't over-collect though. We're very careful about how much we collect, but then we put those into agricultural production. We actually plant, say, even a tenth of an acre. It may sound small. That's a lot of agricultural ground for an endangered species. And we can put them into agricultural production and then go from handfuls of seeds to pounds and pounds of seeds, especially over time. Many of them are perennial, so if a field lasts for 2, 3, 4 years, we get multiple harvests. And one example is the Nelson's checker mallow that I mentioned earlier. we've produced hundreds and hundreds of pounds of that seed, of that species, and put that into restorations, and that's why that species is so much more abundant than it used to be. Yeah, and then you were next. So the question first is, it breaks our hearts to know any species is going extinct, but what about red alder? Is it moving north? And I don't know the answer to that. I think further north, it's not in as great peril currently, but I don't know if it's actually advancing its northern edge further north. That's a kind of a different question, and I imagine other people are looking at that, but I don't know the answer. Okay, here, and then here.
You mentioned the national conference and that there were 47 states represented.
Yes.
Which states were not? Just out of curiosity.
So the question was, we had this national native seed conference and 47 states were represented. What were the 3 that weren't there? And I honestly can't list them for you. It's just amazing to me that there were 47 out of 50.
True.
That's good news. So I'm not gonna name any names.
Okay. I'll look it up.
Okay.
Are you working with any winemakers?
Are we working with any
Because
winemakers?
they're certainly feeling this.
Because winemakers are feeling the effects of climate change, that's right. We don't work directly with winemakers ourselves right now, but we do have partners that are doing work with vineyardists. For example, there's the Oak Accords developed by Willamette Partnership, which is an effort to allow vineyards winemakers to label their wine as participants in the Oak Accords. It's kind of like salmon friendly, but it's oak friendly. And so that's an example. There are also other colleagues of ours that are looking at ways to incorporate native plants into the rows between grapes to create better habitat for pollinators, for example. But it has to be done carefully because you can't add a lot more maintenance or weediness, but there are opportunities to really improve blend natural habitat into the agricultural landscape. Yeah. Okay, I lost track of where we were, but I'll just go back there.
I've got a couple of questions.
I'll take the second question first. Do I know why McDonald's is planting palm trees in Oregon? I have no expletive deleted idea. Back to your first question. Tell it to me again.
We need to buy a bunch of
Oh, where to get trees, for example.
complex, and I'm just wondering which nursery
Yeah.
could help us select trees.
I mainly work in prairies, so I don't have a lot of information on tree nurseries, so I'm not going to offer you anything. But I will say that most nursery, is there somebody got an idea back there?
You can go to Bosque.
Bosque Dell? Excellent.
And get credit on your passport.
But even now, most nurseries are not carrying, say, our future climate adaptive types. The information's just not out there yet very much. So it's hard for people to get that and know how to respond or how well it will be received. So I think it's okay to ask nurseries though. Do you have any of our future climate analog species, or genotypes? See what they say. And then right behind you. Well, that's a great question. And if I might distill it, are there efforts to help indigenous peoples and other people who live off the land to find a path forward in a changed environment where the species or the habitat that they rely on is changing? And I don't know the answer to that. And when we talk about solastalgia or ecological grief, the amount of grief experienced by native peoples in this context is beyond anything I can even imagine. And I think we can share some of that grief, but theirs is a order of magnitude or more than what we've experienced. But I don't have an answer to that question, but I think that is an excellent and community discussion worthy question that I think would be good to talk more about. Thank you for bringing that up. Okay, I'm going to go here and then we'll come back this way. Well, so the question was, when we're talking about the sweet spot between all three circles, are we creating something like a new species, or are we blending new communities of different species? Is that right? Great question. What's intended there is not to create a new species, but to broaden the gene pool of a species that already occurs here, so that it has more genetic diversity from its future climate type as well as throughout its current area, so that it's no longer really fragmented from all of its populations, but it has all of the genotypes to deal with that are relevant to that area. The question of switching up the species mix is also on the table, because there are some species, perhaps red alder is an example, that simply aren't going to do well here in the future. What do we do instead? White alder might be an interesting surrogate, for example, for red alder. A more extreme case is the Oregon ash, which is being attacked by the emerald ash borer kind of insect. And given the experience elsewhere in North America, when the emerald ash borer enters the ecosystem and starts attacking ash, we have to expect that essentially all of our ash trees will die, all of them. And that means when we're planting something, say in a riparian area along the stream where it's been ash dominated, we need to rethink completely what to plant there. So that's kind of almost a shortened time horizon of what we're talking about with climate change. It's like, we're eliminating a species, you have no option, it's gone, what are you going to do? And that's the kind of decision we're going to face more and more with climate change.
Was doing.
Well, I don't know in particular which milkweed planting you're talking about, which was, there was a milkweed planting, and how are they doing? I can say that we've grown a lot of milkweed, in the order of 30,000 of them through prison nurseries, and many of those have been put out on the landscape on public lands. Many of them didn't do very well, and some of those were put out in spring of 2015. And does anybody remember what happened in the spring of 2015? It was hot and dry. It was a furnace, and it killed a lot of plants. But we're also learning about milkweeds that you can put out seeds and almost none of them come up. So if you're going to put out seeds in a restoration site, you have to put out a lot of them. You can put out plugs and some of them survive, not a lot, but it's best to put out rhizome cuttings. So if I was gardening with it, I would go after rhizome cuttings. That's where you're going to have your best establishment. So I didn't really answer your question, but that's what I know. Okay, you and then back there.
Reconcile that?
Yeah, well, mind blown. So this Taylor's checker spot is a subspecies of a butterfly called the Edith's checker spot, which is quite widespread on the West Coast, from California to British Columbia. And from place to place, it is usually on some member of that family. So its host plant is in that family, because there are these aminoglycosides that are the secondary compound in the leaves that the butterfly is queuing in on, and when it eats those, of course, it makes it taste bad to predators. And so that's just like why monarchs eat milkweed. They eat it because it makes them bad to eat, right? So it's a defense. And it turns out that the English plantain is in that same family and is also rich in that same defensive compound. So it's really lucky for that butterfly, especially here in Oregon, that weed entered the landscape. But it's, of course, more complicated than just having the right host plant. That butterfly would be common if all it needed was English plantain. Because I'm willing to bet $20 I can walk out of this library and within 1 minute find you some English plantain. It's everywhere. I mean, really. Anybody want to take me on? I didn't check before I came in, but it's usually a safe bet. So there's more to its habitat requirement than just that that plant. But without that plant, no habitat is going to help it. So we could talk about Taylor's checker spot for hours, because it's such an interesting system, but we're not going to. But you can talk to me later. And then back there. Well, because it's not the same story everywhere for every species. In some cases,
like they're being cut.
In some some cases they're doing better because the climate seems to be shifting in a way that might benefit them. So, and we've looked at even rare endangered species and done climate modeling with their population dynamics, like I showed you with that little lily from Southern Oregon. And we find that in some endangered species, yeah, climate change is just going to slam them down. But others, maybe not. They might actually do better. The problem with modeling is, you know, the old saw with models is all models are wrong and some models are useful. And so the models might be right-ish, but what's tricky about forecasting in the future with climate change and how it'll affect individual species is that sometimes what's going on is a third party is coming in because of the climate change, and that's what's going to modify things. It might be the climate warming is good for mice, and mice eat all the seeds, and then the plant goes extinct. But without the mice, the plant would have done great. So it's so hard to predict. Or it weakens the plants, they were doing okay, but then a pathogen comes in. Or it doesn't even weaken them, but the pathogen comes in because the climate changed. It's so hard to predict because there's so many moving parts. It's like 57 roulette wheels going at once, and you're like, I kind of think it's these three, but you know, we'll see. I think I fell into a rabbit hole there. Okay, so the question was, Oregon's, one of its biggest industries is the nursery industry, and they grow a lot of plants, trees, et cetera, and ship them everywhere. And how could we work with them to grow the right things for the right place? Largely what the nursery industry is growing is plants for horticultural trade. And largely what I'm talking about is wildland restoration. And so they're separate industries. But as I mentioned, we had this National Native Seed Conference. One of its major goals is to support the native seed industry, the production of seeds and plants for habitat restoration. That can bleed over into horticultural uses as well. Sure, many of those plants do great in the garden, but the main focus is in developing an industry that has been undeveloped so that the supply chain for restoration is strengthened. All right, I think that's it. Thank you very much for coming.